I understand your high school is in Portland, is that correct?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to introduce myself. The other judges will introduce themselves, and then we want to have you introduce yourselves, please. So I am Margot Lambert. I'm a professor of history at the University of Cincinnati, Blue Ash College, and happy to be here with you.
Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court. Everything's fine in Salem. You have nothing to worry about.
You're muted.
I keep doing that. Hi, my name is Tandy McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina for about 20 years. But right now I am teaching high school students very much like you, except it is supposed to be 88 degrees here. I'm guessing it's not 88 there. No, wait, you're in DC where it's also not 88.
So please introduce yourselves.
Fellow judges, we are Unit 1 from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. My name is Ben Bachman.
My name is Gabriel Topping.
My name is Riley Hale. My name is Thomas Nguyen. My name is Graham McFarland, and we're here with our teacher, Ms. Deepa Squall.
Excellent, welcome. So yes, Unit 1, we are asking question 2. The foundation for good government is the rule of law. John Adams once wrote, "Good government is an empire of laws." How, if at all, is the law, how, if at all, is the rule of law embedded in our founding documents? What challenges to the rule of law, if any, have we experienced in our history? And in what ways, if any, has the rule of law been important to the preservation of a free society?
Let a crown be placed thereon, by which the world may know that in America the law is king. 6 months before the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine's Common Sense articulated what many Americans saw as the fundamental principle upon which America was founded. But it wasn't until 1885 that A.V. Dicey brought the term rule of law to the forefront of British and American political thought. While having differing theories of the rule of law, scholars like A.V. Dicey, Lon Fuller, and Tom Bingham all espouse that no one is above the law and all are subject to the same law.
1776, the Declaration severed ties with the English government that backslid on the rule of law. The king had abolished our laws, deprived us of trial by jury, and taxed us without our consent. The Constitution then unified the states under a common sense rule of law. Articles 1, 2, and 3 delegate specific and limited powers to the 3 branches and establish that officials can be removed from office upon a breach of the law. The oath clause of Articles 2 and 6 ensure elected officials adhere to the Constitution and satisfy their duty to uphold the law. The supremacy clause of Article 6 binds the states under the rule of a federal law. But while the founders were successful in creating a government ruled by law, they failed to protect the human rights of the 1/5 of Americans held in bondage.
The great question of slavery strained the rule of law. Secession violated the inherent perpetuity of the entire Constitution. For as Lincoln said, perpetuity is implied in the fundamental law of all national governments. As a conflict over slavery, the Civil War presented the question, what rule of law is America going to have? Would it be one marked by a subservient race, or one with due process under the same law, regardless of race? The Civil War amendments provided for a more equal rule of law, protecting the rights of all citizens. Along with the incorporation of the Bill of Rights in cases like Gitlow v. New York, the amendments represent how the Civil War shifted the country towards a more equally applied law.
The rule of law protects citizens from the tyranny of the rule of man. It restricts the power of the government, lessening its ability to interfere with the rights and liberties of its citizens. The necessity of the rule of law to the preservation of a free society is best demonstrated by its absence. The internment of Japanese Americans following the bombing of Pearl Harbor deprived 120,000 people of their liberty without due process as afforded under the 5th and 14th Amendments, a direct violation of the rule of law. Even though the court failed in Korematsu, the independent judiciary created in Article 3 has been essential to maintaining the rule of law. It's helped stop power grabs through cases like US v. Nixon and Trump v. Vance, preserving a free, democratic society.
We're living through another challenge to the rule of law right now. The fallout from President Trump's tenure. He withheld aid to Ukraine in a quid pro quo, pardoned political allies, and incited violent insurrection against the Union. He declared himself untouchable, saying I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose any votes. He threatened to pardon himself before leaving office, and he continues to undermine faith in our electoral processes. His administration showed us the places where our laws can fail, where they give way to rule of man. He showed us how our systems can fail, and the places where we can and must do better if we wish to ensure, as Paine wrote, that in America, law is king. Thank you. We are ready for your questions.
Thank you. That was a wonderful opening statement. And I have lots of things I'd like to talk about here, as I'm sure my fellow judges do. You mentioned the importance of the judiciary in protecting the rule of law, and you gave some good examples, Trump v. Vance, but I want to also give the opposite and be antagonistic here. What about the Supreme Court and its ruling on Bush v. Gore? How do we rein in a Supreme Court that is increasingly powerful and may not be adhering to the rule of law?
I think that's, well, actually, first of all, Bush v. Gore is an interesting example because the rule of law was actually cited on both sides of that case. And I think one way that we can improve the independence of the judiciary, which is something that Tom Bingham talked about a lot, is by, actually, I think abolish, no. I'll let one of my teammates think about it.
I think one thing that the courts did well in Bush v. Gore, while I think there was a lot of issues in that case, I think one thing they did well was by ruling that it should not be used as precedent for future cases, which I think helps establish a standard that at least these cases will continue to go to the courts. We won't have any sort of precedents, or we won't have a precedent set regarding what could be not necessarily fraudulent, but miscounts in our elections.
More specific to Bush v. Gore is the fact that the Supreme Court isn't supposed to have that kind of decision-making power regarding elections. Elections for the presidency are clearly listed in Article 2, Section 1 as being based on electors electing a president. And so I think that clarifying and improving that section in the Constitution would allow the Supreme Court to be fully hands-off in terms of elections, which I think is something that it should be in order to be politically neutral.
I'm curious how much faith you put in provisions like the oath clause. You cited it as one example of something that upholds the rule of law. I'm running for Congress as a conspiracy theorist. I believe the election was stolen, and I will take an oath to support the Constitution because I believe that's my belief. How does something like taking an oath uphold the rule of law, even though it is a nod to the rule of law?
This makes me think of Mitt Romney's speech on the day of the January 6th insurrection. So following Romney voted to impeach President Trump following the second impeachment. Romney cited taking the oath as his impetus to act within his own private morality to vote to impeach Trump, because Romney is a deeply religious man. It would be against his religious views to go against the oath that he took, and unfortunately, not all politicians adhere to the oath clause as much as Senator Romney.
Yeah, and I completely agree that the oath is a nod. It doesn't, people don't have to hold to it. We actually have in the McCarthy tapes that were recently released, McCarthy calls out the oath. He mentions that they have an oath that they have to uphold, and as such that the Republican Party has a duty to hold Trump to account. And of course, they didn't. McCarthy chose not to. He walked back on statements he had made in private, and in public continued to support Trump.
And I think, well, fundamentally, it is to some degree a nod. It is up to us, the people, to uphold that oath. If we feel that our officials are not upholding their oaths, it's our duty as voters to vote those officials out. And I think education is really important so that people actually understand if their officials are upholding their oaths to the Constitution or not.
Okay, so I'm going to just push you a little bit harder on that, and then I'll get off stage. It takes 2 years for me to get to vote him out of office, probably, or 6 years. Can the country survive? Is the system efficient enough to allow the kind of miscreants that we have seen throughout our history, not just now. We may be seeing it more pointedly now because of our communications and knowledge, but we've always had miscreants. Is there a concern that we don't have time and the system is not designed to give us the time to uphold the rule of law as people?
I would argue that our system can't sustain itself. Following the 2020 election, President Trump and his staff filed 62 lawsuits in several swing states challenging election results. According to Mark Elias, legal researcher, 61 of these suits ended in failure. And in Wisconsin, Nevada, and Arizona, these cases were decided by judges appointed by President Trump himself, showing that the durability of our independent judiciary.
Building off of that, I think even broader, the system of checks and balances we have is specifically designed to uphold the rule of law, even if any one individual is acting like without regards to it.
Say more about that. How?
The different branches are able to check each other. So even if, for instance, the executive is like trying to, let's say in the case of USB Nixon. So the executive was withholding information from the public and was trying to withhold information in spite of a congressional subpoena. And our system of checks and balances, I'd say, prevailed there as the courts ruled that he had to go along with the subpoena.
And in the opposite direction, president has veto power over bills sent to it from Congress. And this allows there to be a check, even if it is just from the president himself, over the conspiracy senators that are passing these laws.
Another example of checks and balances, albeit flawed in my opinion, is the impeachment power that Congress has over the president. And you can see this, obviously the threat of it in US v. Nixon, and then in my opinion, the failure of it with the Trump presidency.
It sounds to me that there seems to be an emerging, an idea that there is just a fundamental conflict between the rule of law, one of the great American ideals, and democracy, another fundamental American ideal. Is there a conflict between those two ideas, of democracy and the rule of law?
I think that democracy is fundamental to the American idea of the rule of law. Our country is founded on the idea that our Constitution is a social contract. Our preamble to our Constitution and Article 7 show that it is because the people give power to the Constitution that we have the laws in place that we do. And I think that these two coincide along with our democratic process to support each other. And
yet I can find an enormous number of cases where the rule of law seemed to demand one thing, and the majority of the people, the demos, wanted something very different. The civil rights legislation of the 60s and 70s was extraordinarily unpopular among the people, particularly in the South. And yet it was imposed on them, and people complained about how anti-democratic it was. So is there, someone push you to think about this idea? We can't just immediately say, there's one. I don't think we can do that. Is there? Tell me about this conflict.
Yeah, and part of this was, I would say, intentional on the part of the founders when they drafted the Constitution, especially with the Articles of the Confederacy fresh in their minds. They wanted to create a rule of law that, while it derived its power from the people, that was fundamentally a representative of the people, at the same time could make maybe decisions at a higher level than the populace. And we've seen that has had both its successes and failures, but I don't think it doesn't necessarily put them in conflict.
Yeah. The enumerated powers of Congress laid out Article 1, sections 8 and 9, I think are, as Graham was saying, really essential. And while I would agree, I think that they are anti-democratic to some level, I think it is important to have those restraints on our government because, as Aristotle wrote about, the excess of democracy can often mean that the rights of the minority are infringed upon at the whims of the majority.
I think another way we can see, this conflict that I do believe exists is in term limits, be that in senators, 6 years, and the Supreme Court is another good example, where it's pretty anti-democratic, but it does help uphold, in the case of the Supreme Court, the independence of the judiciary, which again, Tom Bingham cites as very fundamental to the rule of law.
I would disagree on the idea of our Senate term limits being undemocratic, or our Senate term limits being the best example of undemocratic term limits, but I think our presidential term limits are the best example, as the voters may want to have elect a president for a third time, but we simply don't allow it because at the same time it could allow for someone to just ride a popular sentiment to endless power.
Very nice. What about the Supreme Court? Many argue they have become too powerful. You have 9 philosopher kings and queens. We have no, like you said, it's not very democratic. And what were the founders' thoughts on that?
For one, the founders did not put the process of judicial review in the Constitution. That was established later with Marbury v. Madison.
Well, it's important to note that this concept of judicial review was present in the founders' minds. Notably, Hamilton wrote about it in Federal 78.
And do anybody want to finish with that thought?
The founders didn't necessarily fear the judiciary. Hamilton wrote in Federalist 78 that the judiciary was the safeguard against the despotism of the other branches.
Yes, yes, yes.
Should they have feared the judiciary? Do we have some evidence in history that says, boy, were they wrong not to fear those people?
Wait, are we going after time or?
No,
I
we
didn't
have
see- I
time.
didn't see the
Oh, I'm
times.
sorry. The
Okay.
time is up. That's such
Time
a
is
great
up.
question, Sue. I wish we could hear that.
I do too. You wonderful, just wonderfully done. Wonderful examples. I would be one thing I would kind of look at and think about. I love this idea of democracy, and yet consider and think how the founders themselves felt about being too democratic. And I don't know, maybe that's one of our problems today, being a little too democratic. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting kind of radical here, but I thought you responded well to tough questions. You had great evidence, just very, very well done. I loved especially the part about emphasizing slavery and how not facing that head on, which they really felt like they couldn't at the time, but it did strain the rule of law. I think that was aptly put and well done, and something I haven't heard from anybody else here yet.
I would concur. As I tried to outline your presentation, it followed very clearly the outline of the questions, and one idea led directly and understandably to another. You responded to our questions and challenges with a great deal of nimbleness, if that is indeed a word, being able to bounce ideas back and with each other. It's really hard to work with when you've got a big team like you do. And some teams have struggled with that, but you seem to move very smoothly in this situation. So very nicely done. Congratulations. And I hope you're having fun in Washington.
Thank you. Thank you.
I agree. I thought you did a very fine job. Taking us from the king is the law to the law is king is a nice way to phrase things. I wish we could have been a little more specific about what the rule of law is. Is it a principle? What is it? And some definition would have helped me, because we had a very wide-ranging conversation, but there were a couple of times when we were talking, we're thinking, what does all of this have to do with rule of law? We seem to have gotten into some fun discussions about politics generally and the 3 branches of government generally. But I kept thinking, how is this tied to these folks' understanding of rule of law? So that's the only place I would push you. Very, very nimble responses. You showed a good grasp of history, a good grasp of case law. Thank you for the constitutional application, citing, if you will, chapter and verse of the Constitution. I think that really strengthens the discussion, and could have maybe done a little more with how checks and balances work in action, giving it as much life as Madison thought it had, because he was all excited about it. It's more than just 3 branches of government, checks and balances. That notion of interest counteracting and interest, and ambition counteracting ambition. He had a very lively view of how these institutions were going to interact that I'm not sure we've held on to, and whether especially the failure of Congress to act in the aggressive kind of political way that Madison anticipated is undermining the rule of law. So those are places I just like to have been able to keep going, but that was just a wonderful presentation. Enjoy your time in DC. Oregon will welcome you home when you come back.
Thank you so much.